The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Laura Kaminsky. I'm the Associate Director of Education for the Humanities. And before we start tonight, I would like to apologize for the delay in opening the hall this evening. We are in the process of renovating this hall, and as most people know, renovations take longer sometimes than we hope, and we had a little problem tonight. So we apologize, and this will not happen for the remaining 4 nights of the series. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y, and as I said, to our newly renovated hall, for the opening night of our series, The Shape of the City, Conception, Execution, and Realization. Before introducing our guests, let me take a moment to explain this evening's format. Following the moderated conversation on stage, you, the members of our audience, will be able to submit written questions on the index cards which were distributed as you entered the hall. During the course of the evening, ushers will collect the cards and bring them backstage for presentation. Our moderator for this series is Paul Goldberger, who we are pleased to welcome back to the Y. For many of you, Paul is a familiar and much appreciated face here. But for those of you who do not already know him, let me present a brief word of introduction. Since 1973, Mr. Goldberger has served as architecture critic for the New York Times, where he writes for the daily paper, the Sunday magazine, and the book review sections. He has also contributed to numerous other publications, including Art in America, the New York Review of Books, and Architectural Record. Paul is the author of The City Observed, New York, an Architectural Guide to Manhattan, which was published in 1979. In 1981, he received the American Institute of Architects Medal in recognition of his unique role in furthering the understanding of architecture and its impact on contemporary American culture. Last year, Mr. Goldberg was the recipient of the prestigious Pulitzer Prize. We are particularly pleased that he is here with us for this 4th season of Shape of the City. Our guest architect this evening is Charles Gwathmey. Born in 1938 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Mr. Gwathmey attended the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture and Yale University, where he received his master's degree in 1962. Since 1964, Mr. Gwathmey has been a professor of architectural design at Yale, Princeton, Columbia, and Harvard universities, and at the Cooper Union. Among the many honors and awards which he has received are the Arnold W. Bruner Prize, the Medal of Honor from the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects, a Fulbright grant, and membership in the American Institute and Academy of Arts and Letters. Mr. Gwathmey's firm, Gwathmey, Siegel and Associates, has won over 55 design awards. We are honored to have Mr. Gwathmey with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Paul Goldberg, and our guest, Mr. Charles Gwathmey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm amazed that this is the 4th season of these conversations. I would like to begin by welcoming those of you back who've sat through some of these evenings before, as well as welcoming new people to it, and also saying a word about the environment in which we sit. I am so used to being in a somewhat unpleasant architectural space with this series. It's especially wonderful that this year marks the near completion of the restoration of Buttonwieser Hall. So I want to express my own thanks as somebody who's lived with this room for many years to the Buttonwieser family and Steve Robinson, the architect, for putting this room back in the condition it always wanted to be and making it certainly a little bit easier up here. Why not? All of that renovation and still no new chairs up here, however. But I guess eventually all things will come. My thanks as well to Charles Gwathmey for joining me this evening for what I hope will be as lively a conversation as those of the last 3 years who've been in this series. We're going to follow the format that we've used many times in the past. In a moment, the lights will go down. Charles will show us a very brief selection of some images of his work, telling you only a little bit about them. The idea, as those of you who've been here before remember, is to just kind of give you a little visual memory bank, so to speak, so that when we talk about some of these projects, you'll at least have some image to call upon in your mind if you're not already familiar with them. We'll range as far afield beyond those images as we choose to, and as Laura Kaminsky reminded you, during the evening, jot down any questions that interest you, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can as soon as we're tired of each other and want to talk to someone else. With that, let me ask Charles to take the podium, and we'll look at some slides and then begin.
It's 20 slides for 25 years' work. Very brief. What do I have to do? Where's the slide projector? Can somebody turn on the slide projector? Hey. Now, this is my parents' house, which we designed 20 years ago, and it is clearly an abstract assemblage of primary forms dealing with a volumetric expression of space. It's reductive, but it does represent the beginning and is clearly a reference constantly for our work as it has gone on. An interior of that building, which actually measures in the ground plan 20 by 24 feet. The total area is 1,200 square feet. Wig Hall at Princeton, which was designed almost 15 years ago now, it's hard to believe, was an intervention into a neoclassic temple building expressing the new object in the old frame, a kind of dialogue between modernism and historicism way before postmodernism came into being. But the idea was to talk about the possibilities of a dialogue and the tension that is generated between the two, yet we felt sympathetic points of views. A detail of that building talking about the articulation from one to the other and the intersections of one to the other. Again, volumetric, and I would say primary. Dormitory and dining hall student union facility at Purchase, New York, a contextual problem in a new campus where the mandate was to use brick as the exterior material, and like the houses, it is also volumetric and again abstracted, basically primary forms, and the whole energy of this building again deals with the intersection and the layering of space and the notion of transparency and the referential idea of this major outdoor space in which this object sits, framed by the dormitory rooms around it. An interior of that building showing an interior bay window looking out across to the view, and again referential in the sense that this is an object in the space framed by a building that we also did around it. Taft House in Cincinnati. This was our first real sort of assemblage, if you will, pulling apart a house program and articulating each particular piece of that program as an element, as an object, and then reassembling it if you will, as a kind of village in a place, establishing its own sense of place, its own sequence of outdoor spaces as they move through and make transitions from the inside to the outside. And the first time, a major exploitation of a brise soleil as a separate yet integrated element, sunscreen, on the south facade of the building. That same house from the pool terrace showing the connecting links and the modulation from one element to the other. The idea, of course, to break down the overall size of the potential mass and potential consolidation into an extended construct. The Demonil House in East Hampton, which takes the Taft House and literally puts it back into a single element, composite element, if you will, and recalling for us many of the ideas of the Amagansett House 16 years before. Again, the sunscreen in this building, the Brise Soleil, becoming a major element of the building, and the notion of layering, in this case, much more complex in that the spaces become walls, and the walls become, in a sense, transparent, so that the spaces are walls and the transparencies are simply elevations and planes as they layer up one to the other as the building moves from the north side to the south side, opening out to the views of the ocean. A detail of that sunscreen which sort of summarizes in a certain way the notion of the elements that we've been using over the years, yet in this case making a very intense architectural graphic and assemblage of the parts, sort of consolidating in the end as they do into the entire Brise Soleil piece. The living room space from the balcony, and here's the notion of layering, if you will, through transparencies from one plane to another, adding a kind of thickness of wall, even though they are transparent, and a density of space where a space can define another space as opposed to simply a plane defining a plane. And a view at night, which recalls some of the aspects of the Amagansett House, where the solid and the void become primary, and in this case there are secondary and tertiary elements that are weaving their way through this and making their own intervention and their own objects within the overall frame. Westover School, this is a before aerial shot, and this was really a major sort of contextual effort where we had to integrate a 1960s gymnasium building, which is that building over there, which we felt was clearly unsympathetic. That word will come up again tonight, I'm sure, with the existing campus. And the solution was to design a major arcade piece, which was not only spatial, but spatial to itself, but spatial to the master plan of this school, and it then reframed the field, made a new facade and a new major space, a new entry to the gymnasium building, and put it, if you will, as an object behind the new arcade, sort of reconfirming the original master plan of the main cloistered courtyard building with the outbuildings around the edge of the woods. A detail of the arcade with the observatory tower at the end, showing the grandstand as it faced the field, and the dealing with the various levels and the various constraints given in this situation. The interior circulation space, which is dense in the sense that the walls are thick, yet relieved at the top through transparency, and again, the notion of layering of space as it defines other spaces as opposed to simply the planar aspects of certain modern architecture. An early plan by Frank Lloyd Wright of the Guggenheim overlaid on a plan that we are proposing, showing an annex addition at the top left-hand corner on the site of the present annex. An as-of-right diagram showing the two possibilities of adding a sort of stub-nosed tower on top of the small rotunda as one option, which clearly would destroy every sort of ethic of dome and rotunda and skylight. The other is to use the Fifth Avenue park wall idea and simply obliterate the museum completely. The last site, which is the site we're dealing with, is in the, oh, this is good. Looks better. This is not on purpose, by the way. Someone who handed me that card coming into the door turned the slide over. This is the existing annex that Taliesin West built in 1962, and everyone should know, just for future reference, that it was structured and the foundations and the columns were installed to be increased 6 more stories above this present structure. Some model shots that are schematic, not totally as they probably always will be in the state of design, but the intention here is to use this core wall on the east side, the left side, as the transition from the street to a reference to the old annex here, which recalls the brownstone scale of the street, the pink wall, which is the existing structure, retaining it and having it be the transition from, in the horizontal sense, from the neighborhood street towards Fifth Avenue, and then it becoming the reference, the structural reference, and transfer to the 6-story element above it, which, as everyone said, covers the small rotunda, but as you can see in this slide, it is tangent to the balcony of the small rotunda, which follows a geometric construct that we have analyzed from the original Wright building. So that the idea here is to express the gaps between the new and the old, to reveal the primariness of the original building, and to build a very small-scaled and small-areaed new building, which on its own terms is a piece of architecture. We are not Frank Lloyd Wright. We are someone else, but with as much respect and as much intuition as we possibly can. A view from the 89th Street northwest corner, again showing the various transitions and the sort of constructivist implication of the new building. And then finally, the view from Fifth Avenue showing it was what we hope to be a background piece, acting, if you will, as a transition from the neighborhood and an anchoring piece to the new building. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Can this thing go up at all, just so I don't have to, without knocking the whole
That's up.
Is that it? Good, thank you. I get that's fine. Thank you. Okay. I thought it might be more interesting to start not with the building that is on everybody's mind at the moment, but to go back in time and look at your parents' house or house and studio complex in Amagansett that is, as you pointed out, 20 years old. How does it feel to design an icon, which that house really has become? I mean, it's one of the classic images of our time at this point, I think, as as Philip Johnson's Glass House or Venturi's Mother's House or half a dozen other post-war houses can be said to be, but probably not many more than that. Do you think of it as that kind of iconic object or not, as you look back?
Well, I didn't think of it that way when it was designed. It was really a very modest budget on a modest site for my parents. And it was designed as
for your modest parents, right?
For my modest parents and their modest son. And it was so modest that I actually built it physically, because no contractor would touch it for the money that we had to spend. And the thing that's nice about it, and the thing that's difficult about it also, is that it is referential for us, and it is clearly a very powerful image, and it is, on its own terms, unrelenting in that way. And for many years, until I think the de Menil House, it sort of hung over my head, particularly. And now it's sort of there comfortably, feeling good. So the icon of it is something that you've assigned very nicely. I wish we'd go on 10 years and maybe you'll reassign something else that way.
But it has a very, I mean, one of the things that I find so interesting about that house is that it has a, to speak in highly technical architectural language, it has a very lovable quality to it. It has a very, a quality of amiability and accessibility that is not always present in your work, and yet it's not there at any cost to the more serious spatial inquiries that are going on there.
No, I think that's an interesting observation. I just came back from a trip to Europe looking at museums, and I was very much impressed by Sterling's museum in Stuttgart for that same reason, in that aside from it being an unbelievably inventive work of assembled architecture, it is so available and so loved by the town that it is a building that has been embraced in that sense, and one which will endure forever because of that. And I think that's true. I think my parents' house is a sweet little building that is very strong, but also very accommodating from that point of view.
Yeah. What do you, how do you look at the dozens and dozens of buildings that in some way trace a descent from your parents' house that are not yours but those of other architects who have, in most cases, failed to reach that level? I guess that's a rather complicated way of saying that house unleashed a lot of crappy houses.
That's not my fault.
I'm not blaming you.
I mean, you're going to blame me for that too?
No, I'm not blaming you for that at all. I think you know, it's clear from what I said how complete my respect for that house is.
No, that's true.
I'm asking you only how it strikes you. I mean, when you do something, I mean, in a sense, it's probably the same question one could have asked Mies about, you know, what do you think of Emery Roth? I mean, it's sort of, I'm asking you a question that may have a difference in scale.
I'm glad I didn't say it.
It's not, it's not that different in type, okay? It's the, how do you...
well, I've always said, and you know this, because Bob Stern and I disagree about this, is that you have to be very careful when you copy.
Right.
You also have to understand the ethic and the intention rather than simply the grammar or the graphic. And I think what happens is I look at other buildings, which I don't call crappy in the way you did, because I'm not allowed to. I sort of look at them and say that they don't have the same rigor, they don't have the same reductiveness, they don't have the same primariness, and they don't have the same density.
Right.
And that they are about pieces that are awkward in a sense, and just because they are the same pieces, they don't have the integration or the kind of morality, if you will, that I think my parents' house has, without bragging. I mean, I'm not trying to pass judgment, but it's a very easy sort of primariness language, primary language to be seduced by. I mean, the cube,
Right.
the semicircle, the triangle, right?
Yeah, also the drama of
And
that
the-
roof line
right.
cutting into the sky. Sure.
And it's really interesting that that there are ways to assemble it and there are ways not to, and I think that's
Right.
really the difference. It looks simple, but it's not.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. That I think it like Mies looked simple and is not. I mean, I think it's. What do you mean by a word you use a lot, which is reductivist, which you just used again a moment ago?
What I used to mean by it was a kind of Jesuit abstraction, and that you could reveal an intention through the most primary presentation of a form which would communicate an idea, so that it's unadorned, it's on its own terms singular, and it does not rely on a series of overlays or elaborations to make itself manifest or to communicate its intention, right? So as opposed, I guess the easiest example would be to say, instead of putting a molding around the base of the wall as it hits the floor, this was a reveal, a cut away, so that you would reveal the space between the floor and the wall. And that the idea of that, not only making a shadow, but not allowing the two materials to engage visually,
Right.
is reductive. In other words, it is taking away as much as you can before you lose it. And I think in that sense, the idea of abstraction and representation, if you take the two, I don't want to call them extremes, is a line which we sort of tightrope in the work, is that we try, as one reduces something to the point of interpretation, to keep the line clear where one can perceive the idea and make his own interpretation, but still understand the representation.
Right.
God.
I think that was pretty good, actually.
Woo!
Those words were not reductivist.
I'm sorry. I don't want you to think I'm some dumb guy up here. So.
Let me. I would never say that. Let me sort of push that a little farther, though, and ask you.
Farther?
Well, no, you don't have to push it farther.
Okay.
I'll push it farther. About what some of these concepts have with the problem of designing a house. For example, what does being reductivist, what does another term you've used frequently, layering? I mean, what does layering have to do with living? Maybe that's the way I can put it.
Oh.
Where in what designing a house might traditionally be thought to be about, do these things come naturally into play, or do they not? And is it just your choice to sort of make them part of the problem of designing a house?
I would love to talk to that, because we've always, and when I say we, by the way, it's this is a whole effort, as you know. Bob Siegel and
Right.
our associates in the whole office do this together. There's one person that can speak for this,
Right.
so I happen to be it. But the idea of house, which is very important to me, is that the house has always been a building that has universal implications architecturally.
Right.
That has never been an idiosyncratic, off-to-the-side investigation that deals with extraneous personalities and
Right.
preconceptions of clients and habits of clients and all that. We've tended to use the house as the sort of the summary of all of architecture, because it's the microcosm building type. It deals with public and private space. It deals with the series of hierarchies that we talk about in complex buildings, and it deals all the way down to the most finite detail. And we've always used it as a kind of resource, and we've made our clients, doesn't sound right. We've included our clients in a kind of investigative process where they become integrated into an intellectual pursuit that has to do with forgetting about what you used to know necessarily, reevaluate habit as something which can change, and also experience a whole new way, maybe, of perceiving things in 3 dimension that happens to be a house. And I think we've been successful in that aspect of the work, and that we are communicative about what we're trying to do as artists, and the people that are our patrons, literally, are enthusiastic about participating. And so all of the houses actually are small, are models for bigger buildings in their concerns and in their process and in their effort. And they represent different, as time goes on, different investigations at different places in our sort of research and our growth. And that's why we still do them, that they always offer a new opportunity to research and to go beyond what we've done before and to apply that to other buildings.
Yeah, I think there's no question. You and Bob Siegel have been more successful at using houses as laboratories, in effect, than almost anyone else around.
That doesn't make our clients guinea pigs, however. They're seriously laboratories.
What, given all of that, what do you do when you are working for a residential client or residential user who is not your client, say large-scale housing? You've done a couple of dormitories, I know. When you cannot have the direct feedback, connection, whatever, to the people who will actually be living in a space that you are designing. In those situations, are you able to deal with these same kinds of investigations spatially, or do you not? What do you?
No, I think you absolutely do. But I think I think any architect who sort of inherits a program and begins to have the effrontery to design a building for someone else becomes the client. And in designing dormitories and in designing housing for HUD or whoever,
right,
is that the same basic references and the same basic concerns hold true. That is fresh air, view, a hierarchy, privacy, a spatial sequence, an elaboration of that sequence that talks about an experience architecturally, even in the most basic terms, is that none of that's changed, just the constraints are different. So that one has to evaluate the priorities and the hierarchies in situations like that and get the most one can from it.
Right.
You don't eliminate none of the concerns. You just have to put them in the proper perspective and to evaluate the primary hits, if you will, as you go through this to get what you can.
Do you think your work, we're still on residential work now, do you think your work has become more or less reductivist, to use that word you've used again in the last few years? I know you've certainly used more color. You've done more interiors designed to accommodate furniture other than the LC1 chair. Are you moving in a different direction, do you sense?
No, yeah, I definitely do. I think this last 4 years, I guess it is, of sort of reevaluating history, understanding the principles of history and the organizational ideas of historical buildings being relevant, which, by the way, we always have, but the sort of reductivist, abstract kind of dogma,
right,
that was intense in the early work has set up a base, a language base. It's almost like learning a new language, which now allows for extensive elaboration, both in its own spatial complexity, but in the notion of materiality. It's not only color, but it's the use of materials for their texture, for their color, for their primariness, for their support. And the details have become more complex, if you will, to not only talk to the whole, but to the part, and to support other investigations simultaneously. So I think if you can make the analogy between early period and then middle period and then late period in sort of history of growth, right. That we're in our early middle period, elaborating slowly as we go. But never.
Does that mean you're going to end up rococo by the end?
I don't think I'm going to live long enough. And if you keep writing the way you do, I know it will never happen. No, I'll be happy to end high middle, actually.
High middle Gwathmey. I
Right,
can imagine historians 100 years from now sort of writing dissertations on high middle Gwathmey. Do you see the de Menil House as kind of the culmination of the high middle? I mean, the low middle period, or the early middle period, whatever it is.
I think the de Menil House is a summary of the first 17 years.
Right.
And it set up a springboard and set up a whole sort of reference for new opportunities. It investigated a lot of things that it didn't solve, but it opened other doors that are now being investigated and will be solved.
Because I see that house as more complicated than the earlier things, but not necessarily more profound. Which that's not a negative comment at all.
I'm smiling.
It is more complex, but it does not. The nature of the space is not, or the investigation, perhaps we might say, is not as, sort of laser sharp as at your parents' house, for example. But there are far more things going on.
I think that's
bigger. It's more elaborate in every way.
I think that's true, but I think also what happens is that when you investigate multiple issues simultaneously, and you're trying to deal with site scales, gardens, memory, layering, the sort of composite overlay of plan and section, and then simultaneously elaborating that in furniture and adding detail and adding color and adding texture, is that in the end it may not be as sharp, but it certainly dealt with or attempted to deal with all the issues simultaneously, which is why I said it may not be totally resolved, which makes it a summary building of the first years and a springboard for now, which I think is positive. That doesn't, for me, that's not a criticism of it. It takes architecture as what it is, always in process.
Right.
And it's, from that point of view, it's very positive for me. It has a lot of hope.
I also feel, I think I've said this to you, and I think, in fact, you once took it as an insult, and it was never meant to be one. I've always felt great connections between that house and, say, great estates from the 1920s that may have been stylistically very different, but that still dealt with issues of approach, issues of relationship, of enormous house to land and enormous house to subsidiary outbuildings in relatively similar ways.
I agree with that. I think again that the whole idea of the site integrated relentlessly to the house, and that the gardens and the sequence of through gates and approach and what you pass and the whole landscape development as it integrates and intersects into the building was primary, and that really was, again, the first opportunity we've ever had to do that all at once, so that the misses for me are instructional, and the opportunity was phenomenal to be able to attempt to integrate all that in that way, to create really a modern villa of the scale, at least the scale of the site, the scale of memory of the whole thing being one, as opposed to simply just the house, which you insist is big and I insist is really not that big.
It's big. It's not enormous. I mean, it's in fact, I'm not hedging.
It's not as big as this room.
It is not. The living room is not as big as this room, but no, it is. It's certainly bigger than your parents' house.
That's true.
It's bigger than most of the houses you do.
That's true.
It isn't the. What's that house we all read about a year ago? The Sultan of Brunei or whatever.
It's not as big as that house.
Not as big as that house. It is. No, it's not. In fact, it's actually what? It's a 3-bedroom house, isn't it? Ultimately.
4.
4-bedroom. Oh, okay. That's right. There's a little downstairs bedroom. I always forget that. Let me ask you another question about the hierarchies of that house. In that, the layering of the structure itself is created so as to move from the relatively closed entry facade gradually to opening to the rear, I guess we would have to call it, toward the ocean, right?
Right.
Okay. Yet most of the outdoor garden space and space that you use in that house outdoors is not behind it, but either in front of it where the croquet field is or on the side where the pool is.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, does not the way in which the house is used contradict the layering system that's implied within the structure?
Well, no. I would argue it differently, and this is where modern architecture adjusts to specific site conditions. This is a building that is sited on the edge of what is a natural sort of cliff called a dune, and the dune is, on its own terms, a major outdoor extended natural landscape to the edge called ocean. And so the inversion is that the experience of entering and the whole idea of memory in this building is that one goes through all of the man-designed landscape phenomena. The house becomes a kind of transition, complex, transparent transition from that to then the natural phenomena of the dune and the ocean.
Well, the landscape becomes less manicured with each level, right?
Right.
Okay.
And that the idea is that the ocean and nature is on the south and is on the side that is the culmination as you move through all the other. And the idea of the usability, the usable land, is on the, quote, the front side of the house, where you then re-experience and recall all of the landscape options and constructs. So that it's not like a Palladian house where there's a front and then you move through the building and then there's this extended formal garden.
Right.
The formal garden in this case becomes the dune and the ocean, and the construct is asymmetrical and axial to one hand and then parallel circulation to the other. And there's a pond which is man-made but appears to be water in nature.
Right.
A pool which is water in architecture, and an ocean which is nature, right? So there's all kinds of sort of memory and layering of site issues as well as spatial issues.
Right.
So this is an interesting question. In other words, if you did it your way, you would
I'm not
cite.
sure I want to call it my way. It's just a question.
If you did it in the classic way, you would disregard the primariness and the scale of the south part of the site, which would be the dune and the ocean. You would tend to set the house more towards the back of the land and construct the so-called backyard as a four-piece to the ocean, right?
Right, right.
So we chose, obviously, not to do that for that reason.
I think I was seeing it almost more as a public-private dichotomy. The front being more closed and appearing more public, the rear being more open and appearing more private, and yet that puts certain private activities in the public front. But on the other hand, of course, that's a kind of a foolish way to look at a house like that, given that the entire property is private and not located or addressing a street at all. So in fact, it's kind of, I suppose the hierarchy I've just suggested has much more relevance to a street building.
I was going to say that's an urban construct,
right.
not a rural construct.
Right.
So I agree with you.
Okay. I knew it would happen someday. Let's go to Whig Hall. I want to ask you a question about that, which you showed us earlier this evening. You spoke of the dialogue between the classical elements of that little mock Greek temple in Princeton and the modernist ones that are placed inside as an abstract sculpture within a classical frame, or abstract picture within a classical frame might be, and about their speaking to each other. I wonder when I look at that, while I've always admired it visually and found it, in fact, has the same sort of appeal that a wonderful abstract picture within an elaborate gilt frame can sometimes have, nonetheless, they are so distant. I've never gotten a sense that they really did speak to each other that clearly, that they have that much common ground, that they're almost more on a completely different wavelength. How do you feel that they do speak? What are the common things besides just the fact of the original building in framing the newer sections?
Well, I have to do a little backtracking because this is where the history aspect comes in, is that the original temple was set up as on a solid base. One approached it upstairs through a portico. The portico was the transition from the non-sacred to the, quote, sacred. And you would pass through the portico, through the wall, into a single volume that held an icon, a sculpture, or whatever. Athena would be a good one to talk to. Then that model was then transformed over the years into the sort of representative building that had a morality and an ethic because of its symbolic nature. It was irrefutable. However, it was bastardized in the sense of its original intention. The base became hollow. The single space became filled with floors, and a lot of other sort of modifications occurred, so that in I'll call it a kind of naivete and a kind of pragmatism, is what we tried to do with, you have to understand that building had a fire and was gutted, right? Is that what we tried to do, two things. First was to keep the walls of the existing building intact, which were marble and which we felt described the intention of the primary volume. And then the intervention was to put, in a sense, Le Corbusier's domino house slipped into this frame. By doing that, on every floor and in every space, one is aware of the four corners of the original shell, visually aware of the four corners of the original shell. And you sense that this new intervention, this new sculpture, this new piece, object, has been literally slipped down into it, and that there was a most conscious attempt to reveal the original, and that the dialogue is between the intervention and the original. One is mural, one is mural and orthogonal, the other is plastic and pointal. So that the dialogue has to do with the history of how you make mural buildings on the one hand that are classic, and then the issue of free plan and free form on the other, and always, by taking out the sidewall and revealing the object, always to articulate the notion of the single space. So the single space is articulated through the removal of the wall between the base and the cornice, articulated by the pilasters, yet it in itself is its own object. So that's the dialogue. And the base was treated really as a base. One penetrates down to it, and that it is a substructure, right? So that it's by, again, elimination and reductiveness that we felt the primariness of the temple and its ethic and its morality was resupported by the intervention of the new building.
It's hard to conceive of being more reductivist than a classical temple, but which is it
That's true.
itself, I think, a reductivist building. Would you do it in a similar way today, do you think?
It's impossible. I don't.
You don't know. You'd have to.
I would love to be able to do it in a similar way today. I don't think I'd have the guts or the naivete anymore. But so it's interesting. Bob and I, Siegel and I, were talking 2 weeks ago and saying that those were very good times for us because we were sort of out there, sort of feeling our way in a very, as I said, kind of pragmatic, energized fashion. And all of these opportunities came up, and we never really did this whole theoretical, intellectual sort of evaluation that you're forcing me to do now. It's always after the fact that I can be clearer about an intention and evaluate it than I can before, which is exactly how I feel about the Guggenheim.
Gee, what a nice little transition that was.
I was even right on time.
I was even I was even going to ask you another question about Whig Hall, but nobody wants to hear that now.
We can save it.
No. I don't remember what the other question about Whig Hall was now. You see that? Let's talk about a certain job you have around the corner on 89th Street. I have been quite convinced that what both you and the Guggenheim are doing could not be more different from the wildly overambitious plans of the Whitney Museum to turn itself into an institution 130% of its present size, or something like that. This is, in one sense, a refreshingly modest scheme in terms of its square footage. On the other hand, feeling, as I do at least, that the sort of void over the north half of that building, the space, putting it in very simple terms, it's to the left of the big dome when you stand on Fifth Avenue and look at it, that empty space is as crucial to the concept of that building as any mass in it. To fill that up even a little bit is to compromise much of what Frank Lloyd Wright was trying to do. And I say that having, in this particular case, and I'm not merely trying to be nice at all, because there's no percentage in it for me to be nice, but I say that nonetheless having enormous respect for the reprogramming you've done inside the museum, for the idea of liberating the little rotunda on the north side for public use and getting offices out of there, all of which is to the good. I mean, it's a wonderful response to a program. I question whether that program can, in fact, be correctly responded to in such a way as to not violate the integrity of the original building, at least to some extent, which is probably exactly the question that one can justifiably ask about the Whitney as well. I tend to feel about the Whitney that I don't care so much about the integrity of the original building because it's not a building that has the extraordinary degree of importance in our culture and indeed in world culture that the Guggenheim does, and therefore doesn't call for being handled with such kid gloves as the Guggenheim might. What's your response?
Whoa. You like Frank Lloyd Wright better than Breuer, number one.
True. I'll stand behind that.
I would rather answer this question as objectively as I can before we get subjective. I think it's fair to say that every major art institution that deals with expanded collections and is able to acquire collections grows. That there are buildings who 100 years ago one would never even assume that they could be added to, have been added to. And this is not justification for our design. This is to say that this is a fact of life, that institutions have new needs and there are changes that occur in their repository and that additions occur. You just wrote about some additions yesterday in museums. One of them in Idaho, Des Moines, Iowa. That's been added to now 3 times by 3 major architects of their time. The Louvre in Paris is now being added to. And there are many classical buildings that are formally isolated in their own terms, that are closed formal diagrams that have also been added to very successfully. Right. So that, let's just say that there is a precedent, at least I accept, that there's a precedent for adding to great buildings. The fact that Wright's building is a rural building in an urban setting and that it is a modern monument as opposed to a traditionally historical monument makes it interesting and also difficult. It's interesting philosophically and psychologically, obviously, and it's also difficult because on its terms, it is dealing with a private language that is, to say the least, unique, right?
Fair enough.
And so the opportunity and the problem of an addition to this is multifaceted. It's loaded, in other words. What I don't accept is that it would be okay if we imitated Frank Lloyd Wright, because we're not Frank Lloyd Wright, and Frank Lloyd Wright would have done it differently. Maybe better, maybe not. But he would have done it his way.
And
He's not here.
He also happens to be dead, which is
but he
news,
did,
news to the folks at Taliesin.
No, but he did he made a proper. That was good. I'm glad I didn't say it. So anyway, here we go, analyzing a building which many people would deny having a kind of geometrical construct, a sort of order to it, and the building is very ordered. It takes many notions from the Renaissance construct overlay of circles and squares. It's on a 4-foot grid. The entire plan is based on a whole notion of circle and inlaid square and inscribed squares. And we went through this thing both in plan and section and elevation, and we came to at least a map, if you will, a diagram, a map, in which we were able to find a way of exploring an addition that we felt was legitimate to the original construct, not the style. I'm not yet, right?
Okay.
And then within that, to then take the primary aspects of the original building, the negative aspects of the annex, which I happen to think is a terribly difficult building, both on its own terms, in its relation to the number 4 East 89th Street next door, and in relation to the Guggenheim original building.
I think you're actually being rather admirably charitable in those words.
Okay, so I think that the annex is a drag, actually. And it's never solved the problem. It's never worked. It's a lousy interpretation of Frank Lloyd Wright's building and what he would have done. So that I'm saying that our addition, on that hand, deals with the notion of transforming the annex into a building which is both accommodative, programmatically, and then makes, as you said, an indiscreet gesture to the original building. The three things we tried to do was to keep the integrity of the intersection clear, so that wherever we come to face the original building, either in elevation or in section, we've revealed that place so that one feels the original building always resolving to itself, and the transfer zone or the revealed zone is the reveal between the new and the old. And secondly, what we've attempted to do is to take an original structure and then an original geometric construct and overlay them and come to a position that says that this new intervention, and it is an intervention, deals with the character of the street, deals with the transition, the knuckle between the street and the original building, and also accommodates, as you said, a very modest program. Now, I love pamphlets, and I love to get them, but there's one very, I hate inaccuracies. To say that there's only 25% of the expansion is planned for new exhibition space is not true. Over 50% of the expansion is new exhibition space. So that when you write these things, it would be helpful to be accurate about that. But the basis for the expansion is to make the public, for the first time, able to experience the entire museum, the entire original museum, both the large rotunda and the small rotunda, to open up to the public an amazing collection that is now warehoused, and to redispose the existing administration, art storage, and conservation areas into the same area, into a different part of the building, which makes them not a part of the original structure, not accommodative,
right,
but efficient. Now, that's our interpretation. As I told you tonight before the show, there is already a modification of the idea of the cantilevered piece and its proximity to the small rotunda. But that's where it's at for us. And if you say that the building should not be added to, that's a position which then I'm stuck.
Okay. Well, I've never said it should not be added to at all. What I do say, and I concede that this presents a kind of paradox, is that I don't think it can be added to in such a way as to reasonably satisfy the museum's program, in that to add to it more or less in the manner of the Frank Lloyd Wright sketches is in fact to improve it dramatically, because the back of 4 East 89th Street happens to be exceedingly ugly and looks terrible with the museum. So in fact, a more coherent backdrop, as it were, could only improve the situation. If you were truly building up over the annex and not cantilevering forward, I think it's legitimate to say that it would not only be acceptable, but could conceivably bring more order and coherence to the whole project, the whole complex, rather. So that it's not fair to say that the critical position is one of saying not to build at all. However, even as I say that, I concede that suggesting that one build only over the annex is suggesting a building that is effectively a sliver, one of the only places in New York in which a sliver might be justified because it would serve as a backdrop for the Guggenheim, and therefore would, we could create a new type of building. Instead of slivers, we could call them curtains, I suppose. But saying all that, I nonetheless concede that such a building would be too narrow to reasonably satisfy the museum's program, and therefore is not an answer. So I see the situation at this stage not as a matter of right and wrong so much as a paradox at this point. I mean, there is a paradox in that if you move forward with a major cantilever by violating that void in the middle there, you you do compromise the integrity of the building. If you push it back, you can't build a building wide enough to do the museum any good. I mean, if you could get them to tear down 4 East 89th Street, I suppose, which would surely mean all the neighborhood opposition would evaporate in an instant, if that were proposed. There's, the beginnings of a insane solution.
But it is amazing, Paul, when you go back and read the articles of when the original building was proposed and constructed, the outcry, I'm sure
Right.
by many of the same people who are here outcrying again, was unanimous, is that it was an outrageous, preposterous proposal, and how could anyone even conceive of building that building in Manhattan? It should be built in Central Park, it should be built outside. And all of a sudden, with the reincarnation of Frank Lloyd Wright, it's all of a sudden the sacred modern monument, untouchable and unadded to. And I find that interesting only in the sense that that's what history does, is that at the moment of provocation and newness and something that is making an interpretation historically, the outcry from those who are afraid of newness is loud. And then after the newness becomes operational and accepted, the protectivist, the parental aspect of it becomes as loud over
Right,
time.
right.
If we dealt with that sort of situation and never intervened, we would never have progress, we would never have new gestures, we would never have new creation, and sort of it wouldn't keep going.
True.
So,
I mean,
so the predicament is to try to, within the constraints of that site and that building, and within all the sensibilities that we feel we have responded to ultimately convince those in opposition, that, including you, that it is a sensitive and discreet building that is highly respectful and supportive of an intention and a construct yet interpreted
Right.
from the original conceiver. In other words, everyone knocks Taliesin West because they think they are Frank Lloyd Wright reincarnated. That's a very conceited proposition.
True, and I think it is admirable that you are not trying to do that or be that. I would also say, one final word is that I certainly have never felt that the addition is not sensitive. I mean, so that I think in fact we've said it's very sensitive, even if ultimately I've come out in disagreement with it. In fact, it is said so. That is said in spite of believing it's quite sensitive to the issues raised. Let's turn to some of your questions. Here's one that I'm sure you'll be delighted to begin with. How do you feel about the proposed addition to the Whitney Museum?
I think that architects that sign petitions against other architects are outrageous. Is that I believe in someone's creative instincts, and I respect Michael Graves. I don't design buildings like Michael does, but he has always been, for me, a major architect and a pertinent architect in history, and that his interpretation, given certain things that we could all talk about and all maybe criticize like we're doing here, is really not the issue. I think it's provocative, I think it's dynamic, I think his interpretation is absolutely credible given the givens. And if someone else were doing it, they would do it differently. But I think, again, that history and the moment are part of this whole thing, and I'm very glad that it's happening. And so, he's a friend. We don't design the same way. I was just in a building he did in Atlanta, a renovation in Emory, that I thought was absolutely spectacular. And he has sensitivities that are unique, and he has interpretations that I think are compelling. And I think as the Whitney refines itself and that he becomes sensitive to certain criticisms, which we are sensitive to certain criticisms, that it will all come to pass and all be very positive.
Good. Thank you. Good answer. Let me give you two.
Gee.
Gold star for that one. Let me read two rather long.
That's because you like Michael Graves. Let's ask about somebody else.
I don't like all Michael Graves. But actually, I have more criticism of that one than... Never mind, let's not get into that.
No, that's proud.
Let me give you two rather long questions that I think are sort of similar, or similar enough, so that you might want to answer them together. You describe your work in terms of primary forms, almost strictly for their sculptural effects. Do you apply such sculptural concepts in the details of your larger work? If so, on what basis are they supposed to relate to the viewer-user? How does one approach such strong sculptural forms to avoid being overwhelmed by them? Then a somewhat similar question is, can any true urban building be as seductive as your reductive residential structures in rural areas, since street-level vantage points prohibit a singular volumetric sense of the structure? What does this say about the prospects for the quality of life for urban residents? So they're really both dealing with how your work translates into larger scale and urban areas.
Well, I think the issue of primary form is one that has to do with how we, as knowledgeable human beings who understand history, understand Euclidean geometry, understand the meaning of form through our lives, through our educations, is something that we can actually make reference to and actually deal with. So I don't think they're either imposing or exclusive or elitist or uncommunicative in that sense. I really think it's how they are manipulated and how they are assembled, which would then make the human gesture and make the necessary transitions from sort of idealized form into usable opportunities or usable perceptions. When we do contextual buildings, meaning that they could be urban or they could be within a university or a prep school situation, is that we tend to take cues from the existing conditions that are establishing the primary references of the organization of the place or the organization of the site. And that the whole idea is, again, perceiving as someone whose eye level standing up is between 4'6" and 6 feet, and the level of detail that one perceives there, and then the level of detail one perceives beyond is one issue. There's a material issue. There is the notion of layering again, of establishing plane, and then penetration, and then the idea of erosion, and if you want to say reduction or manipulation of form and space, all within a frame. I think Princeton Whig Hall is a contextual building. The frame, if you will, was there. The urban construct was there, and the intervention was not beyond it, but included in it, and that was that kind of solution. So that if you can translate possibly Whig Hall to a urban condition, even the Guggenheim condition, is that I think the approach is always about dealing with the constraints and exploiting them, in fact. So the more constraints there are, the more opportunities you have for dialogue and for interpretation, which I think is
I agree with that
positive.
in principle. The question made me think of another, one of your smaller jobs that we haven't talked about tonight, the Knoll showroom on Newbury Street in Boston. How does that exemplify some of these issues?
Well, I'll tell you a story. When that opened, there was a lot of Boston press walking around the neighborhood asking people what they thought of the building, and I happened to be standing next to one reporter who asked 4 people in a row, "What do you think of the new building?" And they said, "What building?" Which was a terrific compliment. It just sat right in there. Right? No. Didn't sit right in there.
Didn't sit right in there. Nope, nope, nope.
Well, Ada Louise thought it did. And it was built when she was writing. No,
She's not writing anymore, actually.
I think what that building did is it reinterpreted the notion of bay window. It talked about the parlor floor, the ground, the parlor floor, and the floor above the parlor floor as a pedestrian public perception of a building, and then it really reinterpreted the top as a kind of cornice. And it dealt with, on the one hand, the plane, and on the other hand, the modulation of the streetscape. Now, if I did that building over again, I would tend to be more elaborate in the facade and in the materials as opposed to in the sort of formal proposition.
Right.
So to be fair to you and to be fair to a reevaluation, I would be less dogmatic about it being so abstract on its materiality, but I think the sort of the partie was a very strong interpretation.
It always seemed to me, actually, one could go in either direction in a way. One could either be less dogmatic about being abstract and articulate more, as you just said, or use a material other than concrete, like sort of a very sleek, shiny metal, and not be more abstract in a way, and sort of, I mean, not being less abstract. But in any case, let me turn to another question, an interesting one, actually. When given a budget of an ample or more than ample size, do you experience a temptation to over-design or overbuild? And if so, how do you deal with that?
I don't ever remember having a budget of over ample size.
There's no such thing, right?
Well, no, there isn't, not because you're insane, but because the budget offers opportunities that you want to explore and you want to indulge, and I don't mean in the negative sense indulge, but to sort of investigate that kind of indulgence, and that the budget is set and accepted and really does set a certain constraint given the program and the problem. And what we try to do is to understand the implications of the budget and the problem, and to be very rigorous about what the exploration then is going to be, and to say so both to ourselves and to our client in front what the investigation is going to be.
Good. At the Design Center in Queens, the IDC, the atrium is currently painted in a solid white palette. Why have you chosen to downplay the space instead of energizing it with color? And there's a similar question just asking you in general for comment on the transformation of former factory buildings in Long Island City into the International Design Center. I can't resist quoting the beginning of that question, which is, since your firm is not generally recognized for sensitive rehabilitation and renovation work, would you please comment on the transformation of these factories? So you can take those two together.
Well, I'll take the sensitive part first. We actually have done a tremendous amount of renovation, and you should just buy the book and change your question. The other part is that IDC and that atrium space is consciously delineated as a major referential volume, and that the elaboration of it is in the skylights, the bridges, the openings in the walls, and ultimately in the articulation of that stairpiece, which has not been painted its proper color, and the elevator core and the front wall. And the reason for that is that around the balconies, this is talking about a building some of you may not know, it basically was a courtyard, open courtyard to an old factory loft building that we've enclosed and blown away the walls and made a 7-story balconied, I hate to use the word atrium, closed courtyard, if
John
you will.
Portman Gwathmey.
Right, that is modulated, that is modulated by a whole series of insensitive impositions. So the idea of color, I'm not going to do that again. The idea of color was that around the balconies are the entrances for all the showrooms. This is a showroom building, and the intention was, instead of telling each showroom what they could or could not do, was to say that wall behind the facade of the enclosed courtyard was free, and that the collage of all the showrooms and the color and the montage, if you will, collective montage of that graphic, which has to be accidental on a certain level because everyone is designing their own space, is going to be extremely vibrant. And so therefore the atrium then becomes the frame, the neutral frame to all of the architectural graphic that will be then framing it again. So that is it. I also think, by the way, that the white of it presents a dynamic that is actually very supportive of the intention of that space, and that everything that comes into it, including people, make it, enrich it, and intensify it as a graphic.
Good, great. Do you think the failure of the commonplace imitations of your parents' house is the result of a lesser moral vision? Are the architects of these houses motivated by material gain in a way that you are not? If so, can architects be educated to be more moral and to design more morally?
Stand up. Who wrote that? You did? Wow. I really can't pass judgment on my morality versus other people's morality. I think we believe in what we do. Otherwise, we couldn't convince as many people that we have to do it with us, and that the ethic of our work has roots and has a kind of history that is solid. And that's all I can talk to. I can't talk to other people's moralities or other people's intentions. I don't care really about that unless I see someone doing something outrageous.
I think the issue is less one of morality than is one of art, in a sense. I mean, it's these other architects who were grouping anonymously in this way.
What about all the architects that are doing postmodern stage sets? I mean, what about that stuff?
Speak to that.
Well, I think it's all the same. I think that certain times in history, architectural language becomes available.
Right.
My parents' house presented an option, if you will, of a certain kind of architectural language that was very seductive at the moment, was available because it was, in a sense, comprehensible, and therefore could be reused. The difficulty in reusing it as opposed to another more elaborate language is that because it was so primary, because it was so reductive, and because it was so essential to itself, is that it is difficult to elaborate beyond it and
right.
be truthful. to that ethic, right? So that may be also a limitation. You take the postmodern vocabulary, which is also available, yet also much more flexible and much less rigorous, and you can see what has happened in the hands of those who are not as adept as others. And I think that's a natural course of events, is that history has always...
Yeah, but I think that's exactly the point, that you've got to be good. And the manipulation of space ain't so easy. And there are a lot of people who do it crudely and awkwardly, and the results show it. I mean, I think that's all we're saying, that ultimately there is a degree of art to it, which means there's a degree to it that cannot be gleaned by looking superficially at something and trying to knock it off. It just isn't. Let me give you an easier one.
I thought that was pretty easy.
No, okay. Well, I'll give you a harder one then. No, I'll give you one. Here's a chance to give a plug. Will you be designing more dishes and tabletop accessories?
Well, if SWIDPAL had their way, that would be all that we would do. We actually like to do those, and that there's a new exploration now of porcelain. We're a little slow at this. I mean, we sort of resist it, and then we have an insight, and we're 2 years late on our candlesticks. But they had a problem at the factory, a 2-year strike. So our candlesticks are about to come out. We have some silver trays that are coming out. We have some new plates and things. And now we're going to do some porcelain objects. And I think it's all the same. In other words, that's a program, a very limited one, but the whole idea of expressing object and articulating form and making it have its own density on its own terms and becoming articulate on its own terms is exactly the same as designing a building. So it's very rewarding in the sense that it's faster and that you get the realization, and if you're possession-minded, you have the object that you can hold in your hand, and it makes you feel very good.
Great. Where do you see architecture in 5 years? Will the post be passed? Will the visual noise quiet down or be more exuberant? Will there be a return to the forms of Gwathmey and Meyer? That's a firm I don't know, actually.
I think it's quieting down already. I think it's all been very good, and I think history again has shown that in the screaming times of invention, where everybody has to do the new thing and explore the new images to abandon the old, and with all that excess, is that the things that don't really work in the sense that we're talking about get eliminated, and it all comes back to a kind of new level of availability. And that the new level is not going to be post-post or not modern or anything else. It's going to be as classic as any other sort of period that has gone through a kind of exercise and rejection, and then it comes back to terms with itself with a whole new level of information and opportunity, and the elaboration proceeds. And I think it's very positive. I feel better for students now than I did 10 years ago or 5 years ago.
Really, why?
Well, I think that there was so much language that was seductive, in that it didn't allow one to pursue the kind of rigor of exploration of the whole problem. Is that the availability and the facility to, quote, draw architecture, one assumes then it is architecture, was fallacious, and that there was a whole period of students who believed they were designing architecture who were really just making pictures. And I think that's over. I think that there is there is a re-understanding, if you will, of the density of a building that goes beyond the sort of the coloring of a facade.
It's interesting. What you say really reminds me of the great compliment that Philip Johnson paid you when he wrote that afterword to the Five Architects book many years ago, and said that you were the only one of that group who really struck him as a builder, as somebody who...
You think that was a compliment?
Well, I thought it was.
I hated that when he said that.
Why?
Well, because it was sort of the...
I mean, he made like the other guys are doing profound things, and you're
Yeah.
just hammering nails and all
Yeah,
that.
there's the dumb carpenter coming in, a bunch of all these intellectuals, and, you know, I resented it, tell you the truth. I've never forgiven him.
You still resent it?
No, I'm
Okay.
teasing. No, but I think, I do think that the idea of building the intention and the buildability of it and the longevity of it and the understanding of materials and the understanding of their being is critical to the whole design process.
Real buildings as opposed to diagrams and drawings.
Yeah, and also real materials and how they interact with one another and how you detail a building is critical. And the nice thing is to go back to my parents' house 20 years later and not be able to date it materially, is that it has survived. Even hurricane lost a little window, but its glass is replaceable. But there it is, you know, and it is as legitimate a material object as it is an intellectual object, and that makes me feel good. I don't think architecture is temporary.
Good. That brings us around to where we began, which I think is as good a moment as any, since we're actually over our normal time, to call an adjournment. Let me thank all of you for being back here again for this fourth group of conversations. I hope most of you can be here next week again. Please join me in a really sincere thanks to Charles Gwathmey for being with us.
Thank you. It's a good moderator.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.